Welcome back to Pod Save the World. This is a very special day here in Crooked Media HQ. Ben Rhodes is on the ones and twos, as always. That's a DJ term for all you worldos out there.
For the worldos.
Very important. We also have Tony Blinken, one of the nicest people we ever worked with, former Deputy Secretary of State and Deputy National Security Advisor. Tony would walk around with Dennis McDonough, and people would say it was the Baywatch of the NSC.
Yeah,
really.
Well, more like town and country model.
Town and country.
Dennis McDonough. With
Who wrote
Baywatch.
that? Helene Cooper.
Yeah.
New York Times profile. Town and Country. Oh, Dennis will be glad that we're resurrecting that.
I was just tagging along.
Tony, thank you so much for being here. Great to see you.
Thanks, Tony.
Best hair in the NSC.
Best hair in the NSC. So, guys, I was hoping we could start with Brexit because watching British politics right now is the only thing that makes me feel good about our own. So last week, the EU imposed a new deadline of April 12th for the UK to either approve Theresa May's Brexit deal or ask for a long-term extension or exit the EU without ironing out all the thousands of details that govern commerce or travel between nations. Then on Monday, the British Parliament took control of the government's efforts to manage the Brexit process.
What could go wrong?
Well, so I was going to ask you, what the hell does that mean? And would you guys like our Congress to have the capacity to do
Yes.
this?
That's a close call.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about this. The car crash has been playing out in extreme slow motion now for a few months, Tommy. And there's an original sin here that can be avoided, which is the referendum to Brexit in the first place. And the British Parliament and people did not like Theresa May's deal because it creates all kinds of problems for them. And they don't like a no-deal Brexit because that's even worse and potentially catastrophic for the British economy and future relationship between Britain and Europe. But they're kind of casting about when basically any real Brexit is going to have a number of shitty consequences, right? And so you're either going to leave or you're not. If you're going to leave, a lot of these bad things are going to happen. You're going to have to pay a bunch of money to the EU. You're going to lose a bunch of market access. Your citizens are going to lose the freedom of movement they have, and on down the list. And the Parliament can kind of pretend that they're somehow going to generate some deal that miraculously avoids the bad consequences of Brexit and is agreed to by the EU, but that's not going to happen either. So either they're just going to have to swallow hard and Brexit and accept the pain that will go along with that, or they're going to have to figure out a way to stay in or have a what's called the soft Brexit, where they're still in the customs union and essentially you're not achieving what the Brexit people wanted. And that's basically it. And everybody's watching this and they're almost pretending as if there's some magic solution that they can find when it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And especially because the EU has to agree to this, right? If there's a deal, it has to be a deal made with the EU, and the EU has no incentive to give Britain a good deal. Because why would they want to send the message to any other country that, well, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can leave the EU and still have the market access. Well, they're not going to do that. They're not going to give them a better deal than what Theresa May got. So all they're doing is prolonging the inevitable here. And the inevitable is they either have to have a pretty tough Brexit or they have to figure out a way to stay in.
So Tony, over the weekend there were all these rumors of an insurrection in Theresa May's party, that in her cabinet, that she might actually get ousted as prime minister. Do you think that would change anything, or would this just be punting for more extensions and asking for more time for the EU, if there's a major shift?
Well, first, Tommy, I think Ben's exactly right. This is not just the dog that caught the car. This is the dog that caught the car, and then the car goes into reverse and runs over the dog. And it's a total mess. And the real problem is there doesn't seem to be a majority for any scheme, whether it is the May plan, whether it's a softer Brexit, whether it's a hard Brexit, whether it's a second referendum, whether it's annul the whole thing entirely. That's what Parliament's trying to test right now by trying to seize control of this and get a number of votes on these different schemes to see if anything has a majority. Up until now, nothing has. But for Theresa May, rumors of her demise have been frequent. Maybe we're reaching the point where they're actually accurate. But here's the thing. No one wants to be left holding the bag.
Yeah.
The game for those who've been challenging her, who would want to challenge her, who would want to become prime minister, is that let her hold the bag on Brexit. let that get done, and then push her out and take over. No one wants to be there when it actually happens, but we may be at a point where her, sell-by date is real close.
If you were still in the State Department, do you think that you would have been dispatched by Secretary Kerry to go over there to help manage this, or is this a relationship that's so matured that you have to just watch and see what they do?
Look, I don't know what Ben thinks on this, but it's awful tough to walk that line between interfering in someone else's politics, but also standing up for your own interests. And our interest clearly would have been in keeping Britain in. Whether we could actually put our nose in this in a way that would have an effect, wouldn't be counterproductive, is a pretty tough question. But Ben, I don't know what you think.
Well, yeah, I mean, we went over there. Famously, Obama went over there at the request of Cameron. And what was interesting about this is that Cameron was self-aware enough to know that he wasn't a very good advocate for staying in the EU because his own party was for leaving. And then Jeremy Corbyn, as we've talked about, kind of has a secret Brexit, impulse himself. He's an unreconstructed socialist who's skeptical of the EU. So there was no spokesperson really for staying with a lot of stature. And Obama polled at like 80% in the UK, and they said, please come here and make the argument. Now, we went, as Tony said, we went and made the argument based on like our own interests. We want you to stay. Yes, we think that's best for you, and it's also clearly best for us. Clearly, that wasn't enough to move the needle for this. But part of the problem that they have is that there's no one for Brexit or for the EU of a certain political stature in the country to lead them anywhere. It's very interesting to watch a country that essentially is lacking in any political leadership. And part of what's interesting in watching this, and Tony, I know what you think, and Tony actually. You were NSC Europe at one point, right? So you've been watching this for a long time. Not that long, but the national identity of the UK is kind of playing out before our eyes. Like, what is this country? It was the British Empire for a very long time, and then it was kind of the Cold War beachhead for liberal democracy and open markets during the Cold War years. And then it was this kind of, unique bridge between the Americans and the Europeans and the Commonwealth.
Don't forget cool Britannia.
Well, I was going to say, you mix in the Beatles and the British invasion and all that. But really what they're deciding is who are we? Are we a European country or not? Are we embracing the legacy of the empire, or are we moving past that? Are we an isolated island unto ourselves, or are we connected to the rest of the world? And they're doing that without any political leadership. So it's a strange thing to watch, a country trying, an ancient country trying to define what it is in the 21st century, but without any political leaders to point the direction. And that's what's been, I think, so disheartening to watch. And Boris Johnson, the leading Brexit voice, he's the guy who wants to make Britain great again. The empire was great, and if only we could go back. Well, guess what? They're not going back to the empire. Then you have kind of the modern multicultural Britain embodied by like Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. But that is something that is not embraced clearly by people in rural England. They just seem to not know who they are. And to be fair to them, I mean, we're sitting here in the United States. We're having some of the same national identity problems. But this is a pretty profound moment.
And the generational aspect of this is really striking, too. I mean, you have so many young Brits who feel like they have been had the rug pulled out from under them in being pulled out of the European Union, and their own futures, their ability to travel, their ability to study, their ability to work on the continent has been made much, much more difficult. And they feel like their elders have done something to them that they will regret.
Yeah, there's so many components of this that are so unbelievably fraught. So, for example, under Brexit, Northern Ireland leaves the EU with the UK, but Ireland stays in the EU, which ignores the fact that they have a totally open border, and the Good Friday Agreement lets Northern Ireland residents basically choose their citizenship. Now, it was not until I recently read this book called Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe, who I want to have on this show to talk about the Troubles, which is the period in Northern Ireland where the IRA was blowing civilians up at an astounding clip. how unbelievably fraught that period was, how conditional the peace ultimately was, how the factions all still exist. I mean, just wrenching them out of that agreement is an unbelievable thing to do.
And Tony, you worked on this. Do you think the Good Friday Agreement is possible without the EU?
It's certainly a heck of a lot tougher. And I mean, you both referenced something important, because the United States actually played a critical role in getting peace in Northern Ireland. And Bill Clinton, folks who worked with him and for him, were actually instrumental. And this was a perfect case of where a sort of outside honest broker made all the difference in getting these parties. Tommy, as you said, the violence was extraordinary, and the animosities that had been built up over the generations were so hard to peel away. And compromise was seen as a weakness, as a failure. Clinton, through his own diplomacy, George Mitchell, who played an instrumental role in this, they were the ones who really helped bring people together. I think it's a lot harder without the EU. And of course, no one wants to go back to a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But for the Brexiters, this is a real problem, because they think this is the backdoor way of keeping Britain in the EU. So this is why this has been one of the main reasons it's been so difficult to get to some kind of agreement.
Let's go to a much less troubled part of the world, Gaza. It has been a very scary few days in Israel. Hamas has been firing rockets from the Gaza Strip. They've wounded several people, I believe 7 at the last count I read. Israel hit back. They hit targets across Gaza that they said were responsible for the indiscriminate rocket fire that's just hitting civilian homes. The early news reports seem to indicate that both sides are trying to ratchet things down, and Hamas even said that the Egyptians have brokered a ceasefire. But 2 questions, I guess. One, Israel and Hamas, there hasn't been a full-fledged war since, I believe, 2014. How worried are you about the latest conflict? And given the Israeli elections are on April 9th and Netanyahu was actually in the U.S. when the rocket fire began, do you think the timing was coincidental, or is Hamas sending a message here?
Well, look, from my perspective, the only thing worse, as people have said, than an intended war is an unintended one. And I think neither Hamas nor Israel want an all-out conflict. It would be bad for both sides, not to mention the many innocents who would get killed, injured, or made homeless in the process. But it's very, very easy for these things to spiral out of control, and especially when politics is in the mix on the eve of an election. Every single decision is incredibly fraught. So I think there's a real interest on both sides in tamping this down, but it's something you have to watch really, really closely, because we're in such a fraught political period.
Yeah. And one of the things that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, Tommy, is that there have been reports recently of some Palestinian uprising against Hamas in Gaza, some frustration with Hamas's rule, and so part of this, and we'd have to obviously look more carefully and pull the threads on these things, but sometimes a group like Hamas, it doesn't really have much to offer its people other than its resistance to Israel. When they're feeling some pressure internally, you lash out at the external enemy in Israel, right? And so this kind of, I think, speaks further to the dysfunction in Gaza. Obviously, Hamas is responsible for this indiscriminate rocket fire, which is totally unacceptable. At the same time, the question is how do you try to dislodge Hamas, right? Israel's fought multiple wars in Gaza since Hamas took control in 2005. And the reality is this strategy of blockading Gaza, making the people there suffer, I think the goal was to send a message to the people of Gaza that it'll be worse for you because Hamas is in charge. But that's only served to kind of entrench Hamas there. I do think it's worth rethinking whether the all-out blockade that is causing humanitarian crisis is an effective political strategy in weakening Hamas, because they seem to be perfectly capable of entrenching themselves despite this blockade. The people suffer. Hamas is still there. I think it's worth exploring whether trying to increase connectivity between the people of Gaza and the outside world, improve the humanitarian situation might be, both better for the people of Gaza and a different way at trying to get at the need to promote, the Palestinians to be able to choose their leaders.
Hamas's leadership is horrific, and what they're doing to their own people is horrific. At the same time, the living conditions in Gaza, particularly because it's been blockaded, are really unsustainable. One of the most shocking things is that over the last few years, since 2014, the suicide rate in Gaza among young men has gone through the roof. And of course, it's not a far step from someone committing suicide to someone committing suicide with a suicide belt on. And so something's got to give. And one of the things that is clear is we've seen these indiscriminate rocket attacks. They're designed from Hamas, designed to kill Israeli civilians. One of the things I'm proudest of during our administration was the work we did to make sure that Israel had this Iron Dome missile defense system, which was extraordinarily effective. And there was a point during the 2014 crisis when, very late at night, and this was when Ben and I were working together on the National Security Council, the Israelis came to us, the ambassador came and said, we're running out of these interceptors, we need more. We spoke to President Obama the next day on a Friday in the Oval Office. He said 3 words, get it done, and by Tuesday, we had more Iron Dome, money for Iron Dome interceptors for Israel. But here's the other side of the equation. We were talking in the context of Brexit of the lack of leadership in the UK. Israel's about to engage in an election. We'll see what the result is. But there is tactical leadership, which arguably Prime Minister Netanyahu is very, very good at. But strategic leadership is an entirely different question. And it's very hard to see where this story ends if Israel continues on the current course. The absence of trying in a meaningful way to find a two-state solution outcome, I think, creates a huge dilemma for Israel. Because the bottom line is, if the current trajectory continues in the absence of such a solution, Israel cannot remain Jewish and democratic. It either has to subjugate a population that will be majority Palestinian and Arab if it wants to retain its Jewish character, and hence it won't be democratic, or if it is democratic, it will lose its Jewish character. So a choice has to be made. And playing for time is one thing, but avoiding these hard choices is another. And of course, Israelis are right. They haven't exactly had a great partner in the Palestinians. But the need for vision for how to sustain Israel as a Jewish, democratic, and secure state is what's really lacking, at least in this election.
And I think with Bibi, he's good at playing for time through the next election. There's always some gambit at the last minute. Last time it was demonizing Israeli Arabs, and the Arabs are voting in droves, Bibi said. This time it'll be this mix of, bashing, Ilhan Omar at AIPAC and flexing the Golan Heights decision.
I wanted to ask you guys about that because, Bibi was in Netanyahu for the AIPAC meetings, but he also got a pretty big political win from President Trump, who officially recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights while sitting next to him in the Oval Office. Pompeo, I believe, had already made a trip to Israel to have a ceremony there, so it got maximum press coverage. But so the Golan Heights were seized from Syria in 1967 by the Israeli military. In 1981, the Israelis passed a law that essentially annexed the place. They took legal and administrative control over the territory. Should note that the UN does not think that is a valid law, the 1981 law. They declared it null and void. But, I guess my questions for someone who's like, what the hell is a Golan Height? Why is it such a strategically important piece of turf for the Israelis? Why do people find the precedent of allowing annexation worrisome in your mind? And what did you make of this election day miracle for Prime Minister Netanyahu?
The first thing is, consistent with what I was saying about Bibi always trying to get to the next election, that seems to be the only timeline he worries about and thinks about. And meanwhile, all the underlying challenges get more intractable. And unless he really is just playing for time for settlements to displace Palestinians, it's hard to see what else his strategy is. On this one, the Golan Heights are strategically significant because, as the description there, it's the high ground literally, and
you can ski on them.
Yeah, and in the past, before Israel seized them in 1967, obviously if your military opponent has a high ground that is looking down on you, that has military advantages, particularly with the development of new rocket technology. Israel feels like it needs the Golan Heights as almost like a buffer between them and their Arab neighbors to the north. Now, here are the problems. One, for the U.S. president to nakedly and transparently the Golan Heights have not been in the news. There's no reason to be doing this. There's not some ongoing struggle for the Golan Heights.
No one is calling on them to hand over de facto power
There's
to
a
Syria.
peacekeeping force there. The Syrians aren't trying to overrun the Golan Heights. So this did not need to happen. Trump chose to do this, right? So the first problem with this is making a major decision that goes against, but there have been multiple UN resolutions that say that this, under international law, it does not belong to Israel.
And multiple American administrations.
And multiple American administrations have backed that position. So for Trump to change the U.S. position on this territory against multiple UN resolutions just on the eve of Bibi visiting Washington for the AIPAC conference in front of his election plays into the very worst, cynicism around the world that all of our foreign policy is just rooted in domestic politics. Our domestic politics are Israel's, right? That's the first problem. The second problem is all this is going to do, given that this wasn't currently being particularly contested, is once again inflame Arab opinion against Israel and against the United States playing any kind of broker role in these conflicts. And so if Jared has a peace plan in his pocket, everybody knows that would be weighted heavily towards trying to get other Arab states to in some fashion recognize Israel or play a constructive role. Well, this just made that much, much more difficult. Frankly, it only plays into the hands of the Assads and Irans of the world who use conflicts like this to bolster their own legitimacy as the people who are standing up to Israel. So it made the regional dynamic worse while not really doing anything. It's not like Israel got something new. They've already had this kind of de facto control. So the second point is it made the regional dynamic worse. Third is we have spent 4 years since Tony was leading this process in Situation Room rejecting the Russian annexation of Crimea on the basis of international law, that you can't just kind of come in, win a piece of land in a war and annex it against the wishes of the international community and against international law, against previous UN positions. We just handed Putin a gigantic gift. He can rightly say, what the hell is the difference between us annexing Crimea and Israel annexing the Golan Heights? It's exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
And so we are now playing the role that we've been standing up against in terms of Crimea. And so collectively, this is such a Trump thing to do. It's nakedly political. It's entirely to serve his domestic political interests. It makes an intractable conflict in the Middle East worse, and it's a gift to Putin.
Yeah, I mean, Ben said it exactly right. This has nothing to do with security and everything to do with politics. President Trump's politics, Prime Minister Netanyahu's politics. It's as simple as that. And for all the reasons Ben said, it just makes life a heck of a life that's already very complicated, a lot more complicated. One of the ironies is you want to talk about security and Israel's security. One of the things that's actually undermined Israel's security was President Trump unilaterally, without any process, without apparently thinking about it, pulling our very modest force out of Syria. Very different than the 100,000 troops we had in Iraq or the 100,000 troops we had in Afghanistan. A very small force, a couple of thousand, leveraging tens of thousands of local forces to help keep what was left of ISIL at bay, to help keep the other countries in the region a little bit on their heels and not on their toes, and, among other things, to keep Iran from acting out too much against Israel. That he just removed without talking to anyone, including the Israelis. So if I were Netanyahu, instead of praising President Trump in the Oval Office and at this press conference in the rather robust way that he did, I'd be saying to him in private, what did you do? You just pulled the rug out from under us in Syria.
Yeah.
And this guy's such a fucking moron, right? Trump. That if you watch the press conference with Netanyahu, which unfortunately I had to do, he goes on this long rant about Iran, and he goes, because of what we've done, with Iran today, this is a quote from Trump, is a totally different country than it was when I took office. What the fuck is he talking about? It's the exact same country. Like, do you have a map, Tommy? Could you pull it up?
I
Like,
do.
the last I checked, the Iran is the same place.
This is good radio.
The last
Yep.
I checked,
Still here.
Iran it has all the same influence that it's had in
Green
Syria
on my map.
and in Iraq. Iran is actually still complying with the nuclear deal that Trump pulled out of. Like, literally nothing has changed, right? So it just shows that this is a farce. It's just about politics. It's about being able to stand up next to Netanyahu and say, Iran is totally different. Like, what is the backup for that? And who asks him that question? Like, in the press, it's like, he just says these things. Excuse me, could you describe how they're a different country?
I know. One
Like,
follow-up.
Could one, please, I've asked this question before, but could someone in the White House press corps please ask the President of the United States, what is the Iran deal? Could you describe the terms of the Iran deal? He has no idea what's even in this agreement, you know?
I know.
And so this is all a show, and we're all supposed to treat it like it's on the level. Like, we're supposed to treat it like it's like real thought out foreign policy. Well, can you imagine the process that led to the Golan Heights thing? How many meetings do you think there were of like the National Security Council to discuss this? He woke up and he tweeted something because he and Jared and whomever figured out it'd be a good,
A nice gift
for Bibi. Here for APAC, you get to come to APAC and get an extra party favor.
it's a
the
great
Golan
swag
Heights,
bag.
Yeah.
It's swag bag. It's notably on the heels of Netanyahu aligning with a party that is so far right and so overtly racist that AIPAC denounced them. One, two, it's worth stepping back and remembering that these very overt efforts to interfere in a foreign election often don't work, including when Bill Clinton went to Israel in 1996 to endorse essentially Shimon Peres in his race against Bibi Netanyahu, and I believe it backfired.
Yeah.
So,
there's a good lesson there.
Anyway, fucking amateur hour. Anyway, next thing. So, speaking of the Middle East, so the Trump White House, speaking of Syria, recently the Trump White House announced that ISIS has lost its last bit of territory in Syria. I think we all would agree it's unequivocally a good thing, especially for the people that were living under ISIS rule. Can imagine it was hell on earth. But the reporting feels a little bit like Groundhog Day. The New York Times is quoting an analyst in a story today that said ISIS is more powerful than it was in 2011. The pattern basically is that when ISIS loses territory, like they did in Syria, they return to the same guerrilla tactics that they've been using for years, including back when we all called them Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Tony, how big a deal do you think the territorial defeat is, and how far along in the process is that territorial defeat in terms of eradicating the threat from ISIS to the U.S., let's say?
Look, from where I sit, the territorial defeat is a big deal. It does a number of things. It takes away, literally, a physical place to bring various folks who would sign up to become foreign fighters in ISIL. There's no place to go. It denies the organization resources in the areas that they controlled, including a lot of oil that they once controlled, banks, you name it. And it actually, even more important, goes to their entire narrative of actually building a state, a physical state. That's been taken away from them. So it's a big deal. But here's the thing, Tommy. First, it was pretty galling to see President Trump go out in front of the helicopter. He was taking off the other day. And again, this is great radio too. Pull out a map and say, here's what's happening now. ISIL's entirely gone, and showed what it looks like now in Syria. And then he showed the map of what ISIL looked like and what Syria looked like with ISIL at the very end of the Obama administration. There are two big sort of red blotches on that map. Well, here's the thing. The one area where President Trump has actually continued Obama's policy was in dealing with ISIL. And thank goodness that he did, because the coalition that we put together, the strategy we put in place, the local fighters that we trained and equipped, that's what got us to this point, the territorial defeat of ISIL. And back at the end of the Obama administration, yes, there were two red blotches left on that map, Raqqa and Mosul, that systematically, comprehensively, we had cut off and isolated. And then time ran out on us, and it fell to our successors to finish the job. But it's a little bit like, and I hate to even put President Truman and President Trump in the same sentence, but it's a little bit like Harry Truman at the end of the Second World War, taking credit for everything that happened under FDR's watch. Right. But to your point, yes, unfortunately, territorial defeat's a big deal, but it's not the end of the story. And we're seeing them revert to more traditional tactics, including in a bunch of different places around the world.
Yeah.
And also the danger as foreign fighters who've survived try to go home and maybe reintegrate their countries and do bad deeds there. That's something that demands very intense international cooperation to make sure we're all working together to track them, to trace them, to stop them.
The one weird thing about this is, as Tony said, we had this plan in place and it was working, and the territory had begun to be taken back from ISIS. We'd taken back a bunch of population centers in Iraq and Syria. That ink blot of ISIS territory on the map had been shrinking steadily. The Mosul operation had begun. We actually gave them the whole Raqqa battle plan. The weird thing that happened is that they delayed that. They said, oh, no, we have to review this. And we thought this was weird. We're on the way out the door. We're like, hey, this is all ready to go. We've got these Syrian forces, Kurds, and Arabs ready to go. And they delayed it for a pretty brief period of time, and then they basically just restarted it. The one thing I've always wondered, Tommy, is like the person who delayed it, the criminal grifter who delayed it, Mike Flynn,
Oh my God, yeah.
is at that same time, we know, climbed into bed with Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, who was the one guy who didn't like the plan because he didn't like that the Kurds were central to the plan, right?
And we were arming them.
And we were arming the Kurds, right? So, among the many scandals that didn't get all the attention that we needed while, we were apparently too focused on Bob Mueller, which we could talk about in a moment if you want, but is why the National Security Advisor for the United States literally slowed down the Raqqa battle plan at the same time that he had business interests with the Turkish government that didn't like that plan. Someone should look at that.
Well, Ben, you'll remember this. The very last meeting of the National Security Council, chaired by President Obama, the last week in office, had one decision teed up, and that was whether to go ahead or not and add to the arming we were doing of the Kurdish-led militia in Syria in order for them to be able to take Raqqa. And that was what was teed up for the meeting. And Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, at the time said, look, I just got off the phone with Mike Flynn, my successor-to-be, and he asked that we not make this decision. And President Obama said, well, look, I have to respect that. They're coming in. We'll leave it to them. If the decision were mine, we'd go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
But, we thought this was on the up and up,
Yeah.
that they wanted to review the plan. But as Ben said, we later find out
Yeah.
that Mr. Flynn has ties with Turkey.
He wants to get paid to render
he wants to-
Golan from Pennsylvania
to kidnap a cleric living in
He
Pennsylvania.
wants to wrap up Enos Cantor in the United States.
It's very strange stories. Two more
By
things.
the way, that's not. I just added the Enos Cantor thing. You could actually believe anything about these people, so I do need to clarify.
I don't think anyone
I'm an
listening
Enos
knows
Cantor
who Enos
fan.
Cantor
Okay,
is.
good. No, we got some Knicks.
What would James Dolan do on that?
Yeah.
Two more things I want to ask you guys about. So there's been this ongoing struggle in Venezuela, as we've talked about a few times on the show. Pompeo told his Russian counterpart recently that the U.S. will not, quote, stand idly by if Russia sends more military personnel to Venezuela to pop up Maduro, who is their guy in Venezuela. This followed reports of at least two Russian planes carrying 100 troops and a whole bunch of heavy things in boxes down to Venezuela over the weekend. As you guys know, so the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela in January. They spent the last few months trying to get the Venezuelan military to defect from Maduro's side to Guaido's side. They've had very little success. Instead, they've ratcheted up, the military's ratcheted up the use of force against protesters and Guaido supporters. So it's probably also worth noting that Russia has loaned Venezuela billions of dollars in recent years. That all gets paid back in oil, so they have a vested interest in the most literal sense. I guess my question is, when you tell the Russians, if you're Mike Pompeo or the Secretary of State, that we will not stand idly by if the Russians continue to send military officers and support to Venezuela, how do you back that up?
Well, someone we worked closely with, former Vice President Biden, used to remind us, big nations can't bluff.
Yeah.
So if there's something behind that, we'll see. I don't think that there is. But here's the thing. In fairness, I want to give the administration some credit, standing up for the one democratically elected institution in Venezuela, the National Assembly, led by Mr. Guaido, putting more pressure on Maduro. Those were good things to do. Those were the right things to do. And they also helped bring some other countries in the hemisphere together to do that. But here's the problem. One of the things they've done is they put all their chips on the bet that increasing this pressure would cause the military to flip. And Tommy, as you said, to date, that hasn't happened. Maduro has done such a good job in literally buying off the senior brass of the military. Cuba has about 1,000 advisors there who are also making sure that if there are any signs of defection, they get nipped in the bud. And now Russia has deployed some forces.
That's a lot.
There. And all of that makes it really, really hard. So the problem now is we've increased the pressure. We don't have a lot of other cards to play, absent an invasion, which would be a catastrophic mistake. And the military's still there. Now, it's possible that at some point we'll hit the tipping point and they go. But by the way, even if that happens, even if Maduro goes, that's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story. This country is so destroyed economically and so divided politically that what follows Maduro will be chaotic and potentially catastrophic unless there is a strong and serious and comprehensive international plan to help put the pieces back together. I've seen no evidence of that coming from the United States.
Yeah, and we've talked. I just think this is, they said it was unacceptable when the chief of staff to Guaido got arrested. Well, he was arrested. They said they're not standing idly by. I mean, the rhetoric they've employed on Venezuela, is only making them look feckless here. And again, like, I've been a bit uncomfortable with this direction for a while. If you really want to solve the problem, you're going to have to get in the room with a bunch of different people, including probably the Venezuelan military and the Cubans. And so if they're not going to do that, there's just going to be this brinksmanship. And this crowd knows how to do that. Maduro knows how to dig in. He's paid off the military, as Tony said. He's got the Russians giving him a lifeline. He's got the Chinese giving him a lifeline. He's got the Cubans. He plays on the social divisions, the people leaving the country or the people who already don't like him. So, we're just kind of continue to drive this car over a cliff without, like, giving it any thought. And, like, we're the Russians are more than willing to back odious characters. Like, we learned that in Syria with Assad. So I just I really worry about the direction of this is taking. And, all the chest-thumping rhetoric in the world isn't going to make Nicolas Maduro step down.
Yeah. It's not good.
It's not good.
Last thing for you guys. So the Barr Spark notes of the Mueller report are now public. That has sparked a bit of recrimination from several journalists on the left who say that, like, the Mueller discussions have been inflamed and ridiculous for a year. So one reporter in particular for Rolling Stone wrote a piece claiming that Russiagate is this generation's WMD. So again, I want to stipulate we haven't actually seen Mueller's report, but I'm trying to. We gotta get a little ringer for you.
Yeah, I just had turned my thing off. Do you guys have the Ring app?
No, what's that?
I mean, it's not an ad on Pod Save the World.
Well,
I just want to be clear.
We're gonna cut this.
Okay.
Let me start over.
Yeah.
Last thing I want to ask you guys about, since we've gotten the AG's summary of the Mueller report, there's been some recrimination coming from the left about whether the media completely screwed this up. The most hyperbolic version of it being a Rolling Stone article that said Russiagate is this generation's WMD. It was actually a Rolling Stone reporter. So again, we haven't seen the report, but I guess I'm just trying to understand how you can make that comparison. One, given the impact of the Iraq invasion that we're still living with, that we just basically spent the last hour talking about. But also, I mean, when you look back at the reporting in the lead up to Iraq, I mean, the New York Times was running stories that said, front page headline, U.S. says Hussein intensifies quest for A-bomb parts. The New York Post had a story on September 16, 2002, Saddam aims to give terrorists briefcase bio bombs, right? Like Ahmed Shalabi, who is an exiled Iraqi politician who was a favorite neocon and a huge source in the run-up to the war, was seen as someone who was giving constant misinformation. And Judy Miller, who was a reporter at the New York Times during that period, said that he provided most of their front page exclusives on WMB to the paper. So I'm trying to find where was the media failure to the extent there was one in the Russia reporting. I ask you guys as people that were involved in the Russia hacking intelligence and have been consumers of the information since, because this reporter for Rolling Stone compares the Steele dossier to Ahmed Chalabi's role in the WME screw up, and that to me seems a touch off.
I think that first of all, I've never quite understood the kind of collection of people on the left who apologize for Putin, because he's basically the most illiberal leader imaginable. Anything that, the values that I think people on the left purport to care about, human rights, free media, LGBT rights, and the man just steamrolls on a regular basis. So there's this kind of weird, but putting that aside, this could seem like a mildly annoying thing on Twitter. I think it's actually really dangerous because let's separate out two questions. There's what Russia did and there's Trump. Nothing about Barr's, Cliff Notes version of the report does anything to diminish in any way, shape, or form what Russia did, right? So if Russia is the WMD here, like
right, in fact, it confirms that they did interfere.
They're very present. Russia, make no mistake, in an operation led by Vladimir Putin on down through their intelligence agencies, interfered in our election through the mass dissemination of social media aimed at supporting Trump and creating societal divisions in this country that we are dealing with to this day, hacked into some of the most significant political institutions in the country, provided that information to WikiLeaks to be released to help Trump, timed the release of that information to help Trump, sought to make relationships with people in Trump's orbit so as to presumably gain information that could help them more effectively intervene in the election. There is nothing, even if you take this kind of stupid, absurd, overcranked exoneration narrative about Trump, there's nothing that suggests in any way, shape, or form that Russia didn't do those things. And that those things should be really worrying to Americans because Russia did them and they're going to do them again and again and again and again. And their objective is a divided, broken America that will no longer be an impediment to their ambitions. And so even if you are, unlike me, somehow sympathetic to Russia's ambitions, or you think that the West is pushed too far into Russia's orbit or what have you, that doesn't diminish the fact that Russia is seeking to continually use asymmetric means to basically break apart our society and diminish our country. So it's offensive to our intelligence and to everything we care about. And by the way, I should say this, as people who are on the left, I mean, I think of myself as on the left, this is not a good look for us to be somehow apologists for Putin or somehow diminishing what Putin is doing in our election. Putin is weaponizing social justice movements in this country to try to sow division. He's trying to, pit the Black Lives Matter movement against the NRA. These are things that we know to be true, right? And again, look at what he has done to LGBT rights in Russia. They've tortured gay people in Russia. Okay? They've killed gay people in Russia. You care about gay rights? How can you apologize for Vladimir Putin and look in the mirror after you've done it?
Look, I agree with that, but it's a separate point. The question is the media. They're saying that this was worse than Iraq WMD. It doesn't seem like there's any evidence of that.
But the media, so then to take the media side of it, I'm shocked by what I learned in the Mueller report to date, and I haven't even read the fucking thing, okay? I've said, if you had told me when I left the White House, and I thought I was pretty alarmist, that fucking Donald Trump Jr. would be like, yeah, I can't wait to get that dirt on Hillary, and had meetings in Trump Tower with a bunch of Russians, and that Trump was negotiating to build a Trump Tower in Moscow through the fucking election, that would have floored me.
And Jared had a back channel.
I only know that because of the combination of these investigations and the media, right?
And let's read the report. That's
Yes.
Because when I used to do book reports based off of Cliff Notes instead of actually reading the book, they usually weren't as good. So let's see the full thing. But here's the other thing that I think we're missing, and Ben really puts his finger on it. What Putin has been trying to do at the heart of everything is to divide us, to play on our existing divisions, to amplify them, to pour gasoline on them, and to get us going at each other, to delegitimize our institutions, to call into to question all of our most fundamental beliefs. And leaving aside the finding of no collusion in the Mueller report, on one level, President Trump is colluding every single day with Vladimir Putin's ambitions, in that every time the president goes after one of our institutions, every time he denigrates the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, Mueller himself and that whole process, or any group you can think of, he is advancing Mr. Putin's narrative. He's actually doing Putin's job for him. Every time he embraces an autocrat and denigrates a Democrat somewhere around the world, he is doing Putin's bidding for him. Now, that may or may not be willful, but it has the effect of actually advancing Russia's objectives to do exactly what Ben described, which was divide us, get us to question our institutions, get us to question who we are.
Yeah.
And to take your point about being fair here, like did some people over predict what would come out of the Mueller report? I'm sure you could find some media that did that, but collectively, I don't really think so. I don't think there was this kind of mass expectation that Trump would be arrested by Bob Mueller or even impeached. Nancy Pelosi went out a few weeks ago and said impeachment was off the table. The media's role, they've been focused on it because it's a big story and appropriately focused on it. And a big story that yielded many indictments and that revealed a lot about what Russia did and revealed a lot about what Trump did. And even if there's not a criminal conspiracy, if it didn't rise to that level, it doesn't mean it's still not a huge story that Russia did this and that the Trump people were at minimum witting of elements of this and welcoming of it. That alone merits all of this media attention. So to compare this to WMD, the underlying event is true, the Russian interference. The Trump associates being witting of that and in some ways engaging with that, even if it doesn't rise to the level of criminal conspiracy, that actually exceeded, Tommy, what I ever thought would come out of this investigation. And so to compare this to WMD is doing a huge disservice. And I do think it's relevant to Putin because Putin wants to be able to say, oh, it's fake news. So I think you are playing into Putin's hands.
I think that a couple things. Like, one, there were some glaringly wrong reports. Like, did Michael Cohen go to Prague or not? Because McClatchy has just let that story hang for the better part of a year. There were some reports that were probably overheated, like intelligence officials say they're not briefing Trump on the best stuff because they're worried he'll disclose it. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. We do know that he disclosed highly sensitive information to like the Russian ambassador in the Oval Office. So, but whatever. Like, but moreover, I think that But moreover, I do think that it is true that a lot of cable news panels allowed people to make predictions, to do punditry that was wrong. But that doesn't compare to like...
But can we put this in context for just a second? We have in the current commander-in-chief someone who, it has been documented, has made 8,000 erroneous or misleading statements as President of the United States, on average more than 10 a day. We have gone from the first President of the United States who could not tell a lie to the current President who cannot tell the truth. And so for anyone, on behalf of President Trump, to go after the credibility of any other person or institution in this country when the President himself is the leading purveyor of fake news, the leading consumer of fake news, the leading purveyor of conspiracy theories, the leading consumer of conspiracy theories, it doesn't hold up.
Yeah.
So let's put this in the right context too.
I agree, but even like, let's say Trump wasn't president. Let's say it was a robot that could only say the truth. I mean, comparing some pundit on MSNBC predicting Trump was going to get locked up or his kids would go to jail to Judy Miller writing a front page story about Iraqi efforts to get aluminum tubes that could be only used to create nuclear weapons, when in fact there were experts sitting in the intelligence agencies who said, no, those are probably just traditional rocket components. Or, you know, to go to one person, Chalabi, over and over again as your source for WME related stories, knowing that he was completely self-interested in this process and wanted to rule Iraq later on. Like, that is a failure that allowed the Trump White House to launder erroneous or half-assed intelligence through the mainstream media and make a case for war that led to like a decade of a disaster.
Bush White House, yeah, and the
Sorry, yeah.
But the I guess the reason I have such a visceral reaction to it though too is that okay, yeah, the Michael Cohen meeting, say that never happened. Like you said, the first point here is that what was the consequence of that McClatchy report?
Yeah,
There's
it's a
no
footnote.
consequence.
It's an afterthought.
The consequence is McClatchy looks stupid, and nobody's been
Right.
able to prove it.
Right.
And so if your point is, how once again the mainstream media reported some things are wrong because they were too invested in a certain narrative, okay, I can engage with that, but the point is that in the scale of what's happening in our country and in the information space, as Tony says, of our country, that McClatchy report is not the most concerning thing here.
God, no.
We're dealing in a situation here where the scale of what is at stake between the Trump, Putin, and again, this is why I do kind of have a reaction about why are we doing this on the left? Like Trump, Putin, Bibi, Erdogan, the far right parties in Europe, Brexit. Like we've got enough coming at us here. This is like the existential challenge of our generation as to whether this wave of authoritarian strongman, post-truth, us versus them politics is going to wash over us and wash away everything that we care about. And if you can somehow step back and look at that and think that the Iraq scale problem is some fucking cable news panels and some overcranked predictions about the Mueller report, it's just such a misread of what the actual moment is that we're living through and what the scale of the post-truth politics is that is numbing us every single day. If you can somehow look at that and still think that the biggest problem in American politics the last 2 years is some over-torqued Mueller coverage, like I don't get why that's.
Yeah.
What is the point of that?
Especially when you make that assertion without having, read the Mueller report.
Yes, which I would like to read.
But me too. But that's all we have the time for today. Tony, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you guys.
It is. I think we think you should move to California.
It's not a hard sell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Deal.
Yeah. Well, there's a new Blinken.
I wasn't sure if I
Are
was
you gonna
allowed
plug-
to
are you
mention
gonna
it.
plug that? Are you gonna
John
plug
Rowley
us?
Blinken, 1 month old today, born in Encinitas, California.
Unbelievable. Congratulations, and thank you all over for agreeing to do this because I'm sure you got a lot of shit going on. Literally. All right, have a good one.